Welcome to the latest chat about geopolitics and trade episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, where our guest presenter Punit Oza from Maritime NXT delves into the influence of geopolitics on shipping and trade flows and the impact behind mainstream news stories. In this episode, you will hear about the value of diverse viewpoints in research and not just focusing on shipping. Hear about learning from hindsight on the impact of geopolitical events on trade and applying that to current situations and changes that there might be in shipping as a result, and why a high correlation of factors may not be relevant to prediction, and much more. With that, I'd like to hand over to Punit.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's a pleasure to welcome the next guest on our monthly podcast, William Eduard from Lauritzen Bulkers. Lauritzen Bulkers is a company based in Denmark, owning handy size and now soon, I think, bigger size ships as well. William, welcome to the podcast on chat about geopolitics and trade. It's always an honor to talk to industry experts and learn from them and obviously share some ideas as well. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Punit. Thank you.
William is, just to give a quick short introduction, is head of research in Lauritzen Bulk, and interestingly has a very varied background in terms of having been equity analyst and also in various other roles where he actually gets involved. He's also, from his experience and his constant need for lifelong learning, has been constantly upgrading his knowledge. And when I talk about geopolitics and trade to a research head, it's always fascinating because I believe, and this is my personal belief from the time I was in Klaveness, that research actually can create a huge commercial impact on the business, which is seldom discussed and talked about in the normal discussions that people have about commercial stuff. So it's always fascinating to talk to you on the research side, William. And maybe if you want to quickly introduce yourself and give a bit more background about yourself, and then we can kickstart the whole discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Punit. As you just mentioned, I've been having a very diverse background in terms of coming in as a research in shipping. But just taking it a little bit back, I've been nearly 10 years in investment banking as an equity analyst. And I've also worked in chemical tankers, also as a head of research, and now head of research in Lauritzen. I think you actually hit it right on the spot here on the nail when you're talking about like a diverse background and also continuously to improve yourself. As you just mentioned, I just finalized my MBA and I've been studying sustainability at Cambridge and so on. So get these diverse inputs from all walks of life and also different industries and so on, because they at least give you some sort of information, or at least first some know-how around how you actually see geopolitics and also see how the world's actually evolving. So you don't, it's not only necessarily focused on just shipping.
Absolutely. And actually, I must thank your current CEO, Niels Josephson, who was my first boss in Klaveness here in Singapore when I joined in 2007. And I still remember one thing that he mentioned, and he has personified for me a very interesting blend where he actually worked in Beijing and in Asia for many years and then was setting up the office in Singapore. And in some ways, I found him to be a better understander, a person who understood the Asian culture, but also had the outside perspective, the holistic perspective that brought in. And I remember his comment when we were recruiting the team in Klaveness Asia. He says, we must go for a multicultural, multinational team because culture has a huge impact on how business gets done in this part of the world. And that has effectively, if you transpolate that into the trade space, you actually also put geopolitics in it. And geopolitics is a lot to do with history and culture. So maybe I can get your thoughts a little bit about where do you see from your experience, especially in Lauritzen and before, where geopolitics and trade actually merge with each other, impact each other. Maybe some dated examples. We don't need to talk about any current spaces as well, but maybe examples where you think that, this particular trade flow has developed and geopolitics has a big role to play in that. Maybe some examples from your own experience would be really useful for the students.
There is, of course, there is a lot of a lot of examples here we can dig into, at least from the past. But I think you're quite right. I think also the cultural aspect of also, I think Niels is doing a great job here in Lauritzen as well, doing exactly the same, multicultural here. And I think, of course, that plays a vital role in us understanding the different cultures, of course, but also understanding what are the geopolitical aspect of these cultures. But in terms of getting some examples where we can see that some trades has changed over time, is just to give it a brief one, was from when Australia mentioned that China was behind the COVID. Then they stopped all coal import from Australia. What happened there was that we saw all of a sudden that all that coal coming out of Australia had to find different routes. So they went to India, it went to all different kind of other places. And essentially, end of the day, when we're looking into our market, we're talking about ton mileage. So is that going to increase the ton mileage, or is it going to decrease the ton mileage? Because if it's going to increase the ton mileage, then it's good for the market, for the rates. If it decreases, then it gives more supply into the market, and thereby also decreasing the rates. All else equal, right? So there's just one short example. We also had that trade dispute between China and the Trump administration back in the days. That also affected a lot of agricultural. So we saw a large shift for soybeans going from the US down to East Coast South America, down to Brazil, and then towards China instead. So we could very easily start to see these geopolitical changes affecting the trade when they happen. The thing is, of course, can we anticipate them when they're coming and so on? And to some extent, no, we can't. But we, of course, can, in hindsight, learn from them and see, okay, how can we maybe be on the front seat when things happen? How can we actually go around it? Good idea, or at least a good example, is also maybe the Russian-Ukrainian war that escalated not slowly, but over time, not from one day to another. Also, the trade dispute with Trump back in the days was also something that was worked over time. So we could actually start to see, okay, if this is going to happen, what will the implications be on trade? And then, okay, who could substitute that trade, and where could that potential, now in this case, the US, where could that agriculture then go towards? So we can start to find new clients, new customers, or at least enhance our relationships with the existing ones.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I was coming to, because in my mind, the commercial strategies need to be developed and can be developed using multiple factors. And geopolitics is usually in the subconscious discussions most of the time. But what I find is that consciously, this doesn't really come front and center. I mean, most of the time, when today I teach here on this course, and I realize that a lot of the examples I give from my Klaveness days as well, like the Qatari trade flows into US of fertilizers, which was kind of non-existent till they actually decided to do their things on their own with Muntajat. And we did the Muntajat contract for a while in Klaveness, and that time we didn't realize that this is actually a geopolitical development. The fact that Qataris were looking to take control of the marketing themselves and then create a trade flow which didn't really exist. And we built a commercial strategy around it, because by creating that trade flow into US Gulf with having ships on period, we could then go ahead and take outbound cargoes from US Gulf and make some money out of it. So I think there's a lot of subconscious geopolitical discussions here. And here I must ask you, as a head of research, it's a very fascinating. We usually have, so far we've done 3 episodes, and this is the 4th one. And you can see that most of the discussions are happening with the commercial people, the CEOs, but you being a head of research, I think you have a very unique perspective, because I think research is a part of the business which has, in one way, extremely commercial or commercial implications roles which have commercial implications. But at the same time, you have the advantage of having a kind of a much broader field to play with. The commercial guys have only so much to talk about because they have ships to fix or they have ships to manage. But you guys have kind of the world in front of you to literally go around. So how do you go about doing that? And how do you see some unconventional ways of looking at the same data and trying to come up with some interesting ideas? It'll be fascinating to hear that.
Just a good example of that is... First of all, yes, sitting in research and my team in research, we of course has a much larger playing field than the commercial guys in that sense. But it also makes it a lot more complex and also a lot more comprehensive. That is actually where we also try to utilize this multicultural company, so we can actually start to utilize, because I, as a European or a Danish guy, can't read Chinese. So I rely on my Chinese colleagues to read the Chinese news, what is actually going on in China on the ground floor, etc. And that goes for all the cultural things. Also, we have people here from Brazil. They can speak Portuguese. They can read the news, what are actually going on here, and giving me some input in that sense. But also in terms of just another good example of how we can maneuver around these geopolitical things. You remember back in the days when we saw COVID like evolving in China, we're starting to see lockdowns and so on. In order to see the effect of that, we monitored the seismic activity in the underground in China, so we could actually see in the industrial production live, so we could see if the trucks were moving. And so when they started to open up again, we could start to see all of a sudden there came vibrations in the ground again, and then thereby also we knew that within a short time span, we'll probably start to see cargoes in ports.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I think that's the kind of great example that I would say that as a shipping company and as a research guy in a shipping company, you're looking at seismic data is more or less an impossibility, at least in the previous years that I remember. And that's the power of data, I guess, which is useful. But because it's an information overflow, like you mentioned, there's so much complications around you, and then it is very difficult to kind of get the right analytics done. So kudos to you guys to do what you're doing. But just a quick one, if you can think about and just give me your view on how do you see research as being more a proactive role, which means that you're talking about predictive aspects about things rather than just reactive part of it. Because most of the time we used to have these research presentations from brokers saying last month has been a fantastic month and it looks like an all-time high, but that's a past thing, it's gone. And then when you ask them, what about the next month? He said, yeah, but all things said it's going to be an average month. And it's like, what does that mean? And this is where I feel that, how do you create commercially decision-making ability to be research-centric in some ways? It could be interesting to hear from you, especially from geopolitical perspective.
Yeah, but in that sense, of course, you can always learn from history and learn by wrongdoings and learn by different kind of aspects going back. But of course, the whole essence here is, to have the predictable power. And that is what we're trying to achieve here. We are forecasting on the market every single week. And we are, of course, doing that because if you're looking at figures from, let's just give an example, China, US, whatever, industrial production numbers, then they're usually a couple of months old when you're getting the numbers. So you cannot use those in a predictive power because we are way ahead of that. And remember, industrial production, we are the first line, and when we're in dry bulk shipping, so we are actually even before we actually start to see the industrial production. So we need to have high frequency data that is very reliant and then also very frequent as high frequency, but also very predictive in that sense. So that could be Alibaba search engines, Google search engines, Amazon, and so on. So we can actually see how much are being searched in terms of different commodities, or not commodities, but groceries or washing machines, TVs, whatever. So we can actually start to have a proactive, say, okay, now it starts to pick up in terms of spending. That's just one example, but there's a lot where we need to find these high frequency data and also has some sort of predictability in them, and not just looking at old numbers in that sense. But of course, these numbers, we have these high frequency data, we of course match them in industrial production numbers or PMI numbers and so on, to say, okay, are they actually relevant? Are they having a high correlation? What I always try to say is, yeah, you can easily have a high correlation. I would say that 95 or 99% of all car crashes out on the freeway here in Copenhagen, they have brushed their teeth in the morning. Is it then dangerous to brush your teeth before you're sitting in your car? No, because there is no link there. But there's still high correlation, but there's no link. So you need to find where it is okay if it has a high correlation, but is it also relevant to the actual prediction?
Valid point. And I think that just brings this point to my mind that, with Lauritzen Bulk, you guys have a more complicated issue, because unlike some of the other companies which are in the bigger sizes, which can only do fewer trades, a handy size literally goes around the world and can do nearly all the trades in the world. So degree of complexity goes up by 10 times, maybe 100 times in some cases, because you have certain trade flows which are completely because of interest rates that you can have a trade flow change, or you can even have a country which actually reduces its production considerably, but still does handy size shipments instead of Panamax shipments or Supramax shipments. So how do you kind of look at that space of it? Because of the complications, do you actually feel that it's more like dividing it into bigger chunks and then trying to analyze it rather than to micromanage the whole thing?
I would like to say that we micromanage everything, and we definitely try to. But of course, there is some main elements that is driving the market in that sense. But of course, we'll also, as you just mentioned, it could just on interest rates flip the coin where we actually see the market evolving, and that could very well just also just be price on the same commodity, two different parts of the world that can completely flip the change. So yeah, it is of course a big spider web working in the handy size compared to, let's say, Panamaxes or Capes. But it also where you can actually find the margins. If you're having a good research team and you're having a very good commercial team, then you can also find these small pockets where you can actually make a big margin.
Perfect, absolutely. And that brings me to the next thing in my mind, which is about managing these risks. So one of the things that you already mentioned about is data and technology. But what would, in your, not just Lauritzen specific, but in general, your thinking as because you actually been around in the industry as well, where do you see this kind of challenge of geopolitics going? Do you actually see that managing these geopolitical risks is purely going to be a technology-based discussion? Or you think that there is an ability to kind of hedge your bets in a different way, taking long-term bets and trying to hedge it in some way, that maybe this country and that country have two different profiles in terms of how they have had historical relations? Do you actually see those strategies coming into the commercial space? Of course, it's all subject to economics and numbers, but do you see that there are better ways to manage? I'll give you an example. We had Precious Shipping as our first guest on the podcast, and they actually invited the head of Google Thailand to come on board of Precious Shipping in Thailand, because they genuinely believe that they want an outsider voice on technology and updates on technology to come and talk to their board and their people, so that their eyes can open up a little bit about what solutions exist and how it does. Because there's such a big universe of potential solutions which is there. How can somebody guide them through the labyrinth of the various options available? So what kind of thoughts do you have on this in terms of solutions? How do you see solutions developing for this particular aspect?
But of course, technology is a big part of our industry, and the availability of data has never been bigger than it is now, and especially also with the AI coming into play. We of course also try to utilize both machine learning and AI in terms of our predictability and also in our research. But so technology is a big part of it. But I think at the end of the day, all the geopolitical uncertainties that we see is to a large extent political driven in that sense. It's the individual political entities that actually foster these, and they can change on an election overnight. What are the main focus and what are the main concerns? So I don't think you can necessarily like hedge yourself in that sense, but what you need to do is be ready to adapt to change. I think that is like maybe the key. Be very adaptable instead of sitting on your hands.
And does having the global presence help? I'm sure it does, because you have the ability to kind of get viewpoints from multiple people on the ground, which makes a huge difference when you come to evaluate these risks, right?
Yes, good point. But being a global player also eliminates risk, because if you're just present in one trade between two countries, if there's going to be a dispute between those two countries, then you're out of business. Being a global company and having a vast net of trade routes and commodities we trade, of course, eliminate the risk of us being caught on the wrong side of that equation.
Absolutely. And I must tell you a funny story. I think it was just when Myanmar was opening up, when Aung San Suu Kyi had been sworn in as the Prime Minister. And Nils, we had an intern from SMU, and the project we gave him was to analyze Myanmar, and I was in charge of that space, and I got some information. And Niels gave me a couple of books saying that this is where the future looks like. And, in Southeast Asia, Myanmar looks like it's coming up a lot. So I actually did go down there, meet the players, and understood a little bit about the local economics. And then suddenly there was a coup and everything changed. So whatever effort we had put was like vanished more or less. So they do have such changes. I mean, whether it's good or bad is another story. That's a political discussion. But business actually changed dramatically out and into Myanmar because of that particular development as well. So you can never be ready. But of course, as you say, you have to be adaptable and ready to change. But let me come down to one of the key topics. Other than the industry professionals who tune into the podcast, we have a lot of students who tune into the podcast. This course is kind of focused on the student that I teach at various universities. And I find that the younger generation, and you've been a recent student as well, so you probably have that. I was also at the CBS lecturing on geopolitics earlier this year. And I found that it's interesting that the students today have access to more data than ever before. Not always the right one. But more interestingly, they are expected to be having opinions and contributing to decision making much earlier in their careers than when we started our careers. So I would say for my first 5-10 years, I never used to really have any say in terms of should we take that call, should we not take that call. And like my boss used to say, I've done all the information, understanding, analytics. This is what you need to do. Please execute and just come back to me and tell me that execution is done. That is not happening now. I've got students who Google when I'm teaching and ask me questions about it then and there. What kind of tips do you have for the students, especially when they're becoming decision makers very early? And more importantly, what kind of qualities and soft skills do you look for when you see these kids and what they will need to succeed in future? It's just a personal question in your opinion, yeah?
Yeah, to answer the first one, yes, the playing field has changed. Being a student 15 years ago and being a student today, the playing field is completely different. As you just said, the decision-making process here, back in the days, it was based on experience because you didn't have the availability of data. So you needed to build up an experience before you can actually be a decision maker. Now you can almost instantly get that information and that experience by utilizing AI, the data, whatever you are now using, and thereby also be very fast in terms of being the decision maker in the company, and thereby also very fast starting to evolve your experience. In terms of, to the other part of your question, in terms of soft skills and so on, I think it's very important to be empathic and be open to change and be open to different cultures, because all different cultures, all walks of life have something to offer, and also some inputs in that sense. And now I'm talking not just from my work, my professional work. It's also from a personal perspective here. It's that if you are empathic and open-minded and hungry, really are pushing, then you can get a long way.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point, that I think the curiosity and hunger are two things which are missing. But there again, I ask you one thing which is interesting. I mean, you have a background, you were in the industry indirectly, and then you're kind of in the industry fully directly now, where somebody like Niels has kind of sailed on ships, and I've got family in shipping and I'm in the shipping space. Shipping doesn't really get, at least in the mainstream media, a very positive vibe. Things go wrong and everybody is jumping up and down saying shipping industry has a problem, including the Joe Biden's famous statement saying you need to reduce your freights because the shipping cost is too high. So it's portrayed as a villain. So when you look at the younger student, the people who are looking to come in the industry, they need to kind of get the impact of the positive impact that the industry is making. There's so much talk about decarbonization, emission reduction, but if you look at the share of industry as a percentage of the overall emission space, it's a much smaller percentage compared to the kind of trade that goes on the ships as terms of global trade. So anything in your personal capacity, and also Lauritzen's ideas in terms of how do we create the positive impact or positive image of shipping, portraying that out there can be a huge impact. And maybe you want to share something through this podcast about that as well. Yeah.
I think you're right. There is, to some extent, I think it's just not going for the shipping industry in general. It's going for all industries, because the news and the media, they're hungry to get the bad case because it's clickbait. So I think yes, if you can decipher the media landscape or the news landscape, and then saying what are actually making an impact in the world, I think shipping is a very large contributor of that. We are by far the biggest trade partners. We are connecting the world globally, but not just the dry bulk ram setting, but a container, gas, oil, whatever. We are essentially connecting the world. Yes, there is of course some pollution, and of course we need to take that serious. We are in a new era where we need to focus on the environment. But I think where you can actually make an impact is in the shipping industry. If you're coming from my old background as an investment banker, it's you're just pushing around paper. Now here you're actually having a true, almost meaningful impact, because you're actually moving a cargo from A to B. You're actually connecting the world. You are doing good things as well, and I think that is maybe neglected in a sense, or to some extent in the industry. But we are actually connecting the world and trying to make a world a better place.
Absolutely. So if I can just, we are nearly end of time here, but before I leave you, I just wanted to quiz you on what do you think is going to be the one biggest geopolitical development you feel in the next few years? The wars are, of course, very much a part of this narrative, but outside the wars, there are things developing like the Arctic route that Russia is looking to open up. There is talk about the fact that there is going to be more decarbonization, and the fossil fuels may lose their steam eventually, and that has a geopolitical implication. Technology is changing massively, and meat substitutes may reduce the grain trade because animal feed demand might go down. Where do you see in the next 10, 15 years will be one of the kind of game changers, if I can ask you?
I think you just hit the nail on, especially some of them. The trade routes change, of course, and the northern route, of course, plays a big part in that, because it's reducing the ton mileage. But I also think technology is going to be a massive driver, and of course, in that sense, or in that connection with technology, also the development of sustainable fuels or sustainable way of doing shipping. But I think demographics over time also changes. And I think demographics are also a very important driver in that sense of where we're going to see trade going forward, and also economically. So it's of course affecting you. You can see India is now the biggest country in the world. 5 years ago, that was China, and going forward, that could be a whole continent like Africa.
Absolutely, and not only just the fact that it's the biggest country, the mix of people is very different than the homogeneity that China finds itself in. This is a very heterogeneous space, so there are going to be tremendous pockets of opportunities. I mean, I again go back to old times when Nils and one of the other port captains, Captain Chakravarti, used to talk about taking the first ship into Navlakhi as an anchorage in 2001 and 2002. I mean, this was a time when the anchorage was an alien space in India, and today the number of ports in India are springing up left, right, and center. So the development space is pockets of opportunities exist, but fascinating to talk to you. It's really nice to have a research guy give his points of view on this aspect, because I can relate to a lot of the commercial parts, but you guys are doing a fantastic job in Lauritzen, and it's great that you guys have actually got this idea of multicultural input sources, which I think is going to be very crucial for you guys to sustain the growth going forward. So I wish you all the best, and I thank you very much for your time, William. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Punit.
Thank you, Punit and William, for that insightful conversation, and thank you for listening. We look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.